Order. Good morning. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. This morning we have the Auditor General's office with us to discuss the report they released yesterday, which is a follow-up report to recommendations made in 2014-2015. We'll ask everyone to ensure that your phones are on silent. We'll begin with introductions, starting with Mr. Horn.
Good morning. Thank you. Bill Horn, MLA for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank, filling in for Hugh McKay from Chester St. Margaret's.
Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic. Good morning.
Benjamin Jessam representing Hamas Plains Lucasville.
Good morning, Suzanne Lonis-Croft, Lunenburg.
Morning and welcome, Gordon Wilson, MLA for Clare Digby.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
And I'm Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, in your chair. And Mr. Pickup, perhaps we'll do introductions, starting with Mr. Atherton on your right.
Good morning, Andrew Atherton, Assistant Auditor General.
Good morning, Michael Pickup, Auditor General.
Good morning, Dianne Chiasson, Executive Audit Principal.
Mr. Pickup, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I have a short opening statement, I guess with short being open to interpretation, I suppose. But thank you so much for having me and members of my team here to discuss our 2018 follow-up report today. I believe this report answers the #1 question that I get asked as Auditor General, and that is, what happens after the audits? And the answer is, as the auditors, of course, we wait 2 years after issuing our audit reports before going back to see whether the promised actions to address our recommendations have been done. In yesterday's report, we followed up on the 20 audits reported in calendar years 2014 and 2015. There were over 200 recommendations made, and we assessed whether they had been completed or not. We set an expectation in our business planning that an 80% completion after 2 years post-audit is a reasonable rate. This year's results show the best ever, with a completion rate of 75%. In 2014, when I returned home to Nova Scotia and the year I arrived as Auditor General, the completion rate was just over 50%. This success in making such progress should be recognized. It has taken commitment and effort by the public service across Nova Scotia, as well as the leadership who have made this a priority. I believe that we audit important subjects, which promote better government, so it's very nice to see these results. My sincere thanks go to all those involved for making change happen and, importantly to us, working with us in a professional and forward-looking manner. Of course, there are still a number of audits where the level of not complete recommendations is far too high. We cite 52 recommendations that have not been completed from 2014 and 2015. I would draw attention to the following of those. There are the surgical wait times, for example, from 2014 with 7 not complete. There's the educational oversight with 7 not complete. There's public drinking water with 5 not complete. Mineral resource management, 6 not complete. Integrated case management, 6 not complete. Responsible gambling, 5 not complete. Business continuity management, 4. Agriculture 3, and procurement 3. So essentially, if you take those 9 audits, those account for 46 of the 52. So I'm just, all of that is in the report, of course, but I'm just trying to provide a little bit of a summary if you want to zero in on any of those areas where the not completes are. So I hope that helps provide a brief overview of what really is a big job. Tracking over 200 recommendations from 20 audits is a big undertaking. Because of that, my special thanks to my team members who did the original audits, but also to the current folks who worked hard to produce this 2018 follow-up report. This includes the members of the team with me here today, but as important are the people back in the office who did all the work to get us here today. And this includes the audit staff, but also the diligent administrative staff, all of who work together to serve the House and provide you with what I believe is an accountability tool to help you do your job. we, not simply I, will now be happy to take your questions. Given that there are 15, we count up roughly 15 audits with not complete. To the extent there are questions on the not complete, the three of us have essentially divided the 15 for five audits each. So there may be back and forth, depending on what your questions are, just to make this a bit more manageable on our end. So we're pleased to be here and respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. We'll start with Mr. Houston of the PC Caucus for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for performing these follow-up audits. When your office does an audit of a department or entity and comes up with some recommendations, those recommendations are generally agreed by the staff, right? It's very uncommon that a department just doesn't accept a recommendation. They're generally agreed, are they not?
I would say 99% are agreed to, not only when we do the audit, but when we come back to follow up. So if you look at the 52 that I'm talking about that are not complete, there's no disagreement with the government. All the organizations agree they still want to do and complete those recs. Okay, so your I guess your measure of success is that when you go back 2 years later, 80% of the identified and agreed recommendations have been completed. 80%. Right. So that's, how do you pick that number? So really, it is judgment, and you know, our judgment would say some of these recommendations are going to take longer. We get that. So 100% is too high, but the bar should be high enough that it seems reasonable. So it really is professional judgment, you know, based on being in this business for 30 years. Mm-hmm. To me, it seems strikingly low. It seems like a very low bar to try and get over. After 2 years, you've got 80% of your work done. I mean, most Nova Scotians would be envious of that kind of a low bar in their professional life, would they not? Well, I can't speak for the rest of Nova Scotians, but I mean, the fact is, when I came in 2014 in my first year, we were looking at a completion rate of 53%. So I said, okay. Maybe I could come out and say, you know, it should be 100, and in an ideal world that might be, but I think I want to be realistic to say if organizations can get to 80% within that 2 years, yeah, they should strive to do better, but that's a starting point. So, you know, now we're at 75, the government is at 75%. If they can get that to 80, well, then maybe it will be time for us to look at, you know, making that bar higher. Okay. Yeah, I hope you do, and I hope they. Most people, when they think of government, they think of move slow, nothing gets done, no sense of urgency, and I think this is kind of Exhibit A for that. That after 2 years, we're impressed that departments got 75% of the work done. It's amazing that we would even consider that to be remotely close to a success. To me, in terms of the 90% of hip and knee replacement patients are waiting 3 times the national standard for surgery. This is the 6-month standard. If you need a hip or knee in Nova Scotia, you're going to be one of the worst in Canada of getting that done. Now the department has said that they're going to bring that standard down to the national average, I guess, by 2020. The Premier said in question period just a couple of weeks ago that he believed that 6-month standard would be met this year. Do you see anything in your follow-up audit that is there a real plan to get us to the national standard, and when could we reasonably expect that to be achieved? Okay, so in terms of the national standard of 6 months, it is the health authority who have indicated, and we have included the response in our report. It's the health authority that has indicated they will meet that national standard by 2020. So we talked in the report about what they told us they're doing in regards to that. But my point was that the initial audit said there should be interim public targets. If you're currently at 1.5 years wait time, for example, on a knee replacement or a hip replacement, and your plan is to get to 6 months within 2 years, essentially, from 2018 to 2020, what are going to be the goalposts along the way so that you can look and say, okay, maybe in 4 months we expect to be here, in 8 months we expect to be here, in 12 months we expect to be here. So that was the discussion from the original audit in 2014 that was agreed to, and that continues to be the recommendation. That continues to be agreed to. So
you haven't seen that? None of that work's been done? None of the path hasn't been charted?
So the recommendation that we had was on the public reporting of these targets, which the Health Authority agreed to. So when we came back and we sat down to do this year, you know, as our starting point, we asked the organization, where do you think you are? So the Health Authority, in complete fairness to them, said, we are not complete those recommendations. We are not going to try to argue we're complete. We are not complete. However, here is our story. Here is our situation, and we reported some of that. So they are doing, we didn't audit this because this is just a follow-up. And when somebody says they're not complete, generally we just report are not complete. But because of the importance of the issues at the Health Authority, we thought it was important to incorporate some context. So they indicated the actions that they're doing and that they're working on a number of things that they believe will see them meet the national standards by 2020. Now, we haven't audited that. We included that for context. And, you know, and I can't speak for the Health Authority, but, you know, they would say that they are going to meet those targets by 2020.
Did they show you any kind of math as to how? So there was additional surgeries last year. There was additional surgeries in the budget this year. So if you look at the wait list and where we're at and you say this many additional surgeries minus this, and I did some quick math, and I don't think there's any, I don't see from what's been publicly disclosed how they could possibly get down to the standard. But did they produce any kind of a spreadsheet for you?
So you know, I do want to say that given that we're following up only on the 20 audits, we didn't re-audit this. So we didn't open it all up to looking for new information. So if somebody says they're not complete, we generally accept not complete and then turn it over to you folks to say, okay, you folks have the discussion with the organization to the extent you're concerned about the not complete. Now, having said that, it's very unusual for us to include the type of context that we did on the Health Authority, but I thought it was important. Myself and the folks with me here, you know, we spent time, we went out, met with the CEO and the senior folks at the Health Authority and said, you know, tell us what you're doing to work on these things, and that is why we have the summary on page 12 and 13. But I think public targets are important because if you look back at the 2014 audit, we reported the 2013 wait times, which for knee and hip replacements essentially were 1.5 years. So we are 5 years later. The 2018 actual wait times just came out for the last quarter in March, and they are essentially unmoved from where they were 5 years ago. So we said, okay. All the more importance, I think, why public targets need to be there. And if you look at the information we presented in the report, the Health Authority has said they are working on enhanced communication tools with the public, and they've indicated they're doing some of these things internally. But to your question, we didn't try to re-audit this or reopen this up. We did just want to provide that information to you as to what they've said they are doing.
Premier says we'll get there in 2018. Health Authority says we'll get there by 2020. Maybe those two statements will turn out to be consistent, I guess, but we'll have to, time will tell on that one. But you mentioned the communications, and the Health Authority is investing resources in communications, and they talk about new communication tools are being created to provide more information to Nova Scotians about wait times and the gains being made. I think you just indicated that there really hasn't been many gains made. That's when you see communication exercises derived around saying how great things they are, we call that a political exercise as opposed to a practical exercise. Are you okay when you see them talking about investing in communication tools as opposed to actually improving the wait times? I guess it goes back to my thing. Do you have any I guess you have no reason to be confident that the 2020 will be met, or concerned it won't. You just have no reason to have any emotional feeling either way. So we haven't assessed, you know, the likelihood, of course, of that happening or the actions that are indicated. But to me, it's a very simple issue on the public reporting of targets, is so that you indicate to people, you know, here's where we are.
and here's where we think we're going to be in terms of how we're going to get from the year and a half, for example, along the way over the next 2 years to get to that 6 months for 2020. Right, so to me, it boils down. I mean, it's very complicated, of course, but it boils down to that simple point of saying, telling people where you think you're going to be along the path over the next 2 years.
Accountability, that's what that refers to. But sometimes governments just say things and then they don't really have a plan as to how to get there. We've been to lots of people that have been still waiting for a doctor for every Nova Scotian that was promised 5 years ago, right? So I like what you're doing and trying to get some accountability and some reporting out there, and hopefully there'll be some response in time to that. I do want to move on to drinking water. So five recommendations from the Safe Drinking Water Audit have yet to be completed. That's pretty concerning to me. We're talking about drinking water, and we have 5 recommendations that 2 years after they've been made have yet to be completed. So the department has said it's a work in progress. Are you confident that those recommendations will be completed at some point? If you go back 2 years from now again, or 5 years from now, or 10 years, do you have any confidence that those recommendations will be completed?
Mr. Atherton.
I think at this stage, we've looked at what they have done. Where we have concerns, we'll consider it for future audits. At this point, the work that they have done has addressed a lot of the specific inspections and procedures that their workers need to do. The outstanding recommendations deal largely with a quality assurance type of oversight within the department, that the department management becomes aware of what's happening and is able to address future concerns.
Last week at Public Accounts, the Deputy Minister of the Environment stated that she had every confidence in that the drinking water in Nova Scotia is safe. Do you, based on your audit of the department and the practices within the department and the recommendations you made, do you have any reason to share her confidence?
Our work wasn't, our follow-up work isn't to look and see whether the drinking water is safe. We're looking at the follow-up, the recommendations that we've made, and assessing where the department is in terms of those. I don't have an opinion as far as the deputy's perspective on things.
Okay, fair enough. If you were to hear tomorrow, that there was a major issue with the drinking water somewhere in Nova Scotia, would you be surprised? Would that be one of the situations where everyone pulled out this 2-year-old Auditor General report and say, it was right in front of us, folks? Would you be surprised if you heard tomorrow there's a major issue with drinking water somewhere in this province?
I wouldn't be surprised or not surprised in terms of the audit, in terms of my experience with it. The department has been working to address the recommendations. There are clearly recommendations that are outstanding, but that wouldn't lead me to surprise or not surprise if a situation was uncovered. From our perspective, if something occurred, it would go into our planning perspective. We would look at it and say, okay, maybe we need to revisit this area, but that's no different than anything that happens across the province.
Mr. Pickup, the door is wide open for an issue with drinking water in this province and until these recommendations are followed, is it not?
Mr. Pickup?
So I think on any of our audits and any of our recommendations, and I would include the public drinking water, I think doing the recommendations or not doing the recommendations aren't a guarantee of something happening or not happening. I think the point of why we pick audits that are riskier areas or important areas and why we make recommendations that we think add value is because we have to believe that when things are not done, right, there always will be the underlying risk that may be associated with the uniqueness of each of the 5 recommendations. So I think I have to hold to a point on all of the recommendations. I say when a recommendation is not done, with that comes a level of inherent risk that relates to not doing it. That's why we made the recommendation, is to cover off a risk. Okay, so but on any of these things, you can't say by by not doing A, B and C will happen, for sure. No, but the reason why you want to do A is hopefully that will give you some assurance, right, and lower the inherent risk of something bad happening.
Risk mitigation. That's risk mitigation. That's what these recommendations are about. And I think that's why, especially the ones around the environment and community services we'll talk about next, but it's risk mitigation. So when the Office of the Auditor General identifies some ways to mitigate risk, it should be a priority of the department to act on those, right?
Well, and I think I would add to that is that, you know, if it wasn't important or it was no longer an issue, then we have the dialogue as we go through this to have that discussion with the organizations we audit to say, do you still support this? Do you still intend to do it? And the answer, in 99% of the cases is yes, the recommendation is still relevant. So I think that's why we do these things, so then you can then engage as you feel appropriate with the organizations we audit to say, well, what does this mean? You have 5 recommendations now done, it's been X number of years, you know, what are the underlying risks here?
Mm-hmm. Have you ever considered, when you make the recommendation, putting an expected completion date by it? Like, this is a recommendation you should be able to do this week with a couple changes to policy in the department. This is one that might take you a little longer because you got to update your computer systems. Is there that type of discussion?
3 points on that. One would be, we generally expect that recommendations should be able to be done within 2 years. So most of these are designed to be things that shouldn't take 25 years to do. So there is that point. Second point is, we're the auditors, we're not management. So decisions on risk management, decision on where to allocate resources, decisions on what to do are really left up to the people running government. So ultimately, a decision to do something or not do something is that of government, and for them to answer to members of the legislature and Public Accounts Committee, for example, as to why exactly they do that. The third point, I said there were 3 points. The third point is, when we get a response to the recommendations that we include in the audits, we very much encourage entities to tell the full picture in terms of, if they think something is going to take 4 years, tell us that in the response, and we'll report that. And if we think that's not reasonable, we'll have that discussion with Public Accounts Committee. We'll have a chat about that. So we have been very much encouraging the organizations we audit to make sure they agree, to try and be specific on the response and try and put timelines around the response. And I think I've seen improvement over the last 4 years on doing that, but we're not fully there. And part of it is, I think we have more to do on encouraging organizations to do that. And I think that will help you folks, so that when you see an organization that just got audited, you can see their response and the commitment they made.
Thank you for that. I want to move on to community services. The computer systems used by community services, I guess it could best be described as kind of an orphan system, I guess. It's obviously an older system in many respects. There's a lot of risk in that computer system, and there's a lot of uncompleted recommendations around the computer tracking, the tracking that's done by it, the security that's inherent in it. There's a lot of risk. What did you think when you saw that 2 years later they hadn't acted on many of the recommendations around that computer system?
Mr. Atherton.
When we looked at this one, what I see is that many of the specific control-related changes that we recommended have been made. The outstanding recommendations specifically to community services, 2 of them, 10 and 11, deal with, they are still the basic frameworks and controls that are needed to manage risks. The other 2, 6 and 7, relate to ensuring proper business continuity planning. So not specific to controls, more big picture work that ties in nicely with our business continuity management chapter. So there are some controls that are still outstanding, and they are working towards accomplishing those.
Mr. Pickup has a comment.
Enough time. If I could, sort of with all due respect, I guess, make a suggestion, although I haven't been asked for a suggestion, I hope I'm allowed to do that. Maybe the committee wants to consider writing a letter to each of these organizations here, the 15 of them, to say, can you let us know when you're going to have these recommendations now complete? What are the risks to doing these in 2 pages or less, right? Not 35 pages per each one. That might be something, you know, you want to do, given the types of questions that you're asking. But again, that's just a suggestion.
I like the suggestion. I like that suggestion. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But if the business continuity risks are very real, like if this system goes down, this could be there's a big mess on our hands here in terms of making sure people continue to get paid, making sure that people are paid that should be paid, and controlling their data. It's very, 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 very important data that's in there. So there is no real business continuity plan if this old antiquated system goes down. We're going to kind of deal with it at the time. Is that really what the department is saying by not addressing these?
Time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts, of the NDP, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Obviously, these recommendations relate to a great number of different departments and different programs. I'm just going to, so forgive me if it feels like I jump around a little bit, but I was just looking at the recommendations related to aquaculture monitoring, and I am the spokesperson on fisheries, and just recently had the opportunity to question the minister in estimates. And so I guess I'm surprised to see the number of recommendations related to, you know, incomplete work, really. For example, one of the recommendations was that the department should develop and implement detailed written guidelines for assessing aquaculture applications, including a requirement for staff to fully document their decisions. That is not complete. Also, the department should determine which fish diseases it needs to monitor and establish an appropriate reporting process to obtain the information from aquaculture operators. Not complete. And also, another incomplete recommendation related to policies and procedures respecting fish health, including regulatory requirements. Can you speak to me a little bit more about about why those recommendations were originally made, and what's at stake that they remain incomplete, given, I guess, particularly the public concern that is frequently expressed related to aquaculture operations.
Ms. Chiasson.
Yes, when we originally did the audit, the department was undergoing just completing some changes in regulations. So when we looked at the fish health program, which 2 of the 3 outstanding recommendations relate to, the fish health program was essentially a volunteer program in that they were offering these services to anyone in the aquaculture or field where they would provide testing on fish, etc. So it was not a regulatory program in that they had rules and regulations that you have to do this and that, and their processes would make sure that that was happening. This was basically voluntary, but the government was also interested in monitoring certain fish diseases, say, but they hadn't established exactly what those ones were, and there was nothing in place to make it happen. They were relying on what was in place federally. So our recommendations were around that. This is where you want to go, and it appeared the regulation changes were going to go there. So in order to do it, you need to establish, okay, what diseases is it you want to monitor, and you need to put in place processes to make that happen. So that's where these recommendations came up, and as of right now, they're not complete.
And in the process of revisiting these recommendations, did you have an opportunity to speak to the department about why those recommendations have been left incomplete?
No, because as part of the follow-up process, we follow up, and if the department says they're not done, then we take their word and we don't do any further work on it. It's only if they said it was complete that we would look at it to see if indeed it was.
Okay, thank you. the Department of Environment has been the subject of several recent audits, and of course the drinking water audit, where there are a number of incomplete recommendations, is also falls under environment. We're some time out from revisiting the more recent recommendations to the Department of Environment. Is there any conclusion that we should reach from the fact that several recommendations have not been pursued and completed related to the drinking water audit that falls under that department?
Mr. Pickup.
So I don't think necessarily A equals B yet. I mean, history sometimes is a good predictor of the future. So I would say, you know, from looking at it from an auditor's lens, if we have an organization that continuously lags behind on implementing our recommendations, those are ones that we would watch closer in terms of looking at a number of issues. So I'm trying to say, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to get those things done, but I think they're worth paying attention to if they are one of the laggers that aren't getting things done as quickly as some of the others.
Okay. I'm going to just continue with the Department of Natural Resources. All of these happen to be my critic areas. So there's a number of incomplete recommendations related to verification of royalties and you know, requesting information from organizations, businesses engaged in mining in the province. Just for example, the Department of Natural Resources should verify and document mineral incentive grant requirements are met before final payments are made, and that's a recommendation that's not complete. Does that mean that the department is potentially releasing incentive grant funds to groups that are actually not eligible for those grants?
Ms. Chiasson.
That relates to some specific grant programs that we were looking at, and if a department doesn't verify that all the expenses that are required to be spent before money is given out, if they give out the money before they've verified that, then there is a risk that they could be overpaying on a grant because the applicant, in fact, didn't incur all the expenses that they should have in order to earn the full amount of the grant. So it is a risk, and that's why we made that recommendation. Mining and Mineral Resources has just been moved from Department of Natural Resources to the Department of Energy. In a number of cases, well, certainly in public comments, related to the audit just yesterday, you know, the explanation for why certain recommendations have not been completed is that, oh, well, we're undergoing, you know, some sort of structural change or, you know, reorganization. In conversations with the department, you know, are you concerned that these mineral and mining related recommendations may not be followed further with DNR because, you know, well, because it's now in fact switching, those responsibilities are switching to the Department of Energy? I'm hopeful that they will take the recommendations with them. We will still be following up on them and looking to see if they're complete, and if it's the responsibility has shifted to the Department of Energy, then we would be looking there ultimately to say, okay, have these things been put in place? So it wouldn't eliminate the recommendations just because of a transfer from another department.
Mr. Pickup.
I would agree with Ms. Chiasson. The only thing that I would add, I think, is that we engage with the organizations we audit to say, have a discussion with us if you think because of organizational change to approach to programs and services that our recommendations are no longer relevant. Don't just say not complete and put them in that category. Let's have a discussion around whether they continue to be relevant. And in this case, this year, out of 53 recommendations, there's only one where we had that discussion with anybody around a recommendation not still being relevant. So they they continue to believe. And I think part of that is because we try to make these recommendations that really are, are principles-based, are about approaching and promoting good government and structure of that, notwithstanding who might be the delivery agent or how it's being delivered, generally these things are transferable from one entity to the other. So just want to add those comments to what Ms. Chiasson said.
That kind of leads me to a number of recommendations, particularly related to surgery wait time performance targets. Recommendations that were made to a number of separate health authorities, many of which, well, 7 of which were amalgamated into the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I think I did hear that excuse that there was time occupied in amalgamation and reorganization. When you checked in with the Nova Scotia Health Authority related to those recommendations, was there any further discussion about why those recommendations were not complete?
So on the surgical wait times. So when we got the package, as we normally do, and how we approach this, and the organization said not complete. So 5 of the 7 recommendations not complete in this case. Normally that's where we would stop, right? Because there is little risk. But in this case, with the health authority, we took a different approach, and me and the folks with me went out and met with the CEO and her senior folks and said, let's engage in some discussion. There was never pushback on the recommendations not being relevant. There was never pushback to try to get things complete, to say they were complete when they're not. The discussion was around the substance of what they're trying to achieve over the next 2 years to meet those national standards. So what we did, I think in fairness, is report in our report, which we normally wouldn't do, sort of a page summary to say, here's what the health authority have indicated that they are doing, without us giving some sort of, forward-looking to say, yes, that will work, and yes, that means you will achieve this. No audit, but just some context to say, here's what they are doing. But it was very much an in-substance discussion. Now, having said that, I still say the recommendations are not complete, and they ought to be complete, and they continue to agree with them. So it's a little more complicated, I think, with the health authority. But at no point did they say these are no longer relevant, or it's only been 3 years. Give us more time. So it's a more complicated story, I think, for us and for them.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. I sort of envy you that you got to have that conversation with the Nova Scotia Health Authority's leadership, because of course the public and us as opposition members don't get to see if those conversations are happening at the board level, because the board meetings and agendas are both closed to the public, and we feel that there's that lack of accountability and transparency is significant and troubling, especially since we have the only provincial health authority that meets in secret. Do you think opening up the Nova Scotia Health Authority would be productive for maintaining pressure in between audits? Because at least we could see, is this recommendation coming back to the board level? Is there a check-in? Is there work in progress?
So, there's a lot of answers I would give to that question, I think, and I would start with, in terms of our access. So, we don't have any issue, of course. Nobody's ever said no when I've called and asked to go meet with them. We have excellent cooperation, and I think that's important, that I want, people in the House to realize, and all of Nova Scotians to realize, is we have an excellent professional, it's independent, but it's a professional relationship with the Health Authority. There are no disagreements here. They're very upfront. And if anything, something I've learned from this follow-up is the respect I have for the Health Authority in terms of not playing any games to say, well, those recommendations were before we existed, they're not for us. No, they realize these things make sense. and here's where they are. So we have no issues on access. We're providing the follow-up. You know, we have followed up that audit for 2 years. We're providing the information to you. I think we've been more than encouraging to the Public Accounts Committee in a respectful way to say we really believe that you should call in these organizations we audit to talk about the audits that they have received, to talk about the work that we do. So I think, you know, we're very much doing our part that way, and I have no issue with any of the organizations that we audit throughout government. So I wanted to say that. In terms of openness and transparency, to go more specifically into some of your question, in terms of sort of how they decide to run an organization. Well, what's important for us is that oversight happens in substance so that things are getting done. So in this report, when we talk about 75% being the highest completion rate, we attribute part of that to the oversight that is happening within government, both by those overseeing organizations, but also the senior management folks, the deputy minister group, the ministers. Like we refer to all of that. You know, I'm convinced now that I've been doing this job for 4 years, that when I meet with people in oversight, you know, they get it, they get the importance of these things. So for me, oversight from my perspective is from the perspective of areas of audit, results of audit, and then the follow-up. So this, to me, this report is a sign that something is working better than it did, and things are heading in the right direction. Now, in terms of how the Health Authority runs its month-to-month business, and in terms of what should be open and what should be available, I mean, those are very much, you know, going into more policy types of discussion, and I think there's lots of expert opinions, I'm sure, on what is open and transparent government, but I'll leave that to those experts.
Thank you for that answer. Just further to the wait times do seem to be related somehow to operating room scheduling, and there's a number of incomplete recommendations related to policies around operating room utilization and scheduling. And when the NSHA was here and TIR was here a number of sessions ago, I was asking for information about, you know, whether the QE2 redevelopment process is being informed by full information about current utilization. And so I find it very concerning that there are outstanding recommendations related to that, because surely if you're building new facilities, you should understand completely, you know, where you're at now in terms of utilization. And would you agree with that assessment that there's some connection between these incomplete audit recommendations and what actual facilities we need to be building in terms of operating rooms to, you know, to be meeting surgical wait times?
So I will have to stick to sort of, you know, the audit results from the 2014 audit, recognizing that we haven't reopened this up and done any audits. But I would say when the recommendations by not being complete, you know, that does leave exposures when things are not complete in terms of the underlying issue that addressed. You have a bit of an update. And with all due respect, I would say I'd probably go back to a suggestion I made earlier that it may be time to reach out to this organization to say, you agree with the 5 recommendations that are outstanding. When will you have those done? What are the risks to getting them done by that time, and give us specific timelines? I think that, you know, with all due respect, I would say that's fair game for a Public Accounts Committee to ask an organization, and it shouldn't be me sort of answering to that, and I won't attempt to answer to that on behalf of the Health Authority, but it should be these folks we audit that answer those questions for you.
Thank you. I'm just again struck. So there were those recommendations were made to Annapolis Valley Health, to Capital Health, and to the IWK, and of course the IWK was able to complete their work on operating room policies. When you looked at the evidence of that recommendation to the IWK being complete, what did you see?
So those were complete last year, so we would have satisfied ourselves. I mean, this is somewhat of a general answer, but we would have satisfied ourselves that the underlying response to the issue and the recommendation would have been covered. So, I mean, we're doing this to a, you know, not sort of a just tell me something. We would ask for evidence of things happening, reports, typical audit type of inquiries to review level of assurance. So, a bit of an audit answer there, but we, you know, when we come and bring comfort that we say something is complete, then we've seen the evidence to show that it's complete. But I can't give you all the specifics as to what we looked at.
Okay. Thank you. I was just given the 1-minute warning, and my next question would take me a minute to deliver, so I think I'll pass the time over. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, folks, for your time this morning. I'd just like to begin, by inquiring. I guess are there particular things with respect to reporting or with respect to, I guess I'm just asking generally, that would attribute to satisfying a more consistent number of recommendations in your view, through the chair?
Mr. Pickup.
So if I'm not fully answering the heart of your question, just come back at me. Because I think I know where I'm heading, but I may be just using it as an opportunity to answer a question that I think that you're asking. So let's put aside for a second, you know, the overall positive results, for example, that we have at the 75%, and let's say focus on we have what 25% that can do better. And what we have said is, you know, those organizations, you know, there's 7 or 8 of them, should look to those organizations that are getting 100%, which there was 12 of, and say, okay, what is happening there? So I think that is sort of at the government level, you know, organizations dealing with each other. In terms of, if I think you're asking me, you know, what might happen to move these 25% along more quickly and see a higher rate than 75%, I do think, you know, I'm convinced that the organizations who've accepted 99% of these recommendations continue to accept them. So I think the will is there. I think the acceptance is there. I think some extra scrutiny from the Public Accounts Committee. For example, we've given you today sort of, you know, the 15 audits where the number of not complete recommendations is fairly high. I think reaching out to these organizations to say, you know, you want to know why and you want to know when they're going to do it, given that, you know, we're in a world here that's somewhat enviable in that we're not in a disagreement about whether they should be done. It's a matter of when they're going to be done. So that's a much easier job, I think, for us, for the organizations we audit, and for Public Accounts Committee to say, okay, then if the discussion is around when these things are going to happen, not if they're going to happen, let's do that. So I think if I answered your question, it is, I do see how the Public Accounts Committee could play more of a role in following through. The other thing I might suggest, since you give me the opportunity, is that the government has an audit committee, and there is an internal audit centre within government. Certainly it might be something to look at those organizations to say, well, can you play a role in providing the Public Accounts Committee with some interim updates, for example? Like maybe, you know, we come back after 2 years, but maybe you want to know beforehand so that you can start making some inquiries to try to push this along, so that rather than wait for us to come to say, you know, there are 25% not done, that with some extra pressure, and I don't mean to suggest that people only do things because of pressure, but I think it's an added element of accountability, that it may move that 75% up to even higher, which everybody will benefit from. So a long answer to what I think was the heart of the question, but I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And through the chair, I appreciate that response. I would like to, I guess, maybe attempt to dive a little bit deeper. I would anticipate, and I guess practically speaking, every department does things slightly differently than the next. I guess what I'm precisely looking to try and identify are there, like, I guess my understanding of, I guess the role of the Auditor General's office is that you report, the office reports on the information that they are able to acquire from departments. Are there particular things that departments across government are doing, consistencies or best practices that would give your office a more substantial ability to identify that recommendations are being completed? Are there activities that they're taking that are able to lend themselves positively to reporting?
I think I would refer to a couple of positive things that are happening, and then some perhaps suggestions on other things that could happen that may contribute. I mean, one of the things that I think is important and has made a difference is I know the clerk of the Executive Council, who's the sort of the senior deputy minister, has made it very important, as has her predecessor, to incorporate in her accountabilities with the deputy ministers that report to her, how are these organizations doing on follow-up? And I know I've met with her enough to get a sense that she has instilled that message to folks. Not that people only do things because of that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I think once it gets to that level and it has that oversight and it's important, that contributes, I think, over the last 4 years to the increased efforts. I've started going in and having a discussion once or twice a year with the entire deputy minister community to chat about things that are important to me in the office, including the follow-up of recommendations. And we've had some dialogue back and forth, right? Are there things that we can do differently? Are our recommendations clear? And if anything, I've really encouraged with the deputy ministers to say, early on when we are in the clearance, if you have an issue with a recommendation, let's have that discussion because we want to make recommendations that are going to be doable, that will result in change. And there's no sense us coming back here every 2 years and saying nothing got done, none of the recommendations are going to be implemented, and we'll just keep doing that. That doesn't make any sense for me or for anybody. So I think that those types of things have made a difference. I think the government audit committee that they have in place is internal to government and is within the deputy minister side. I think that has made a difference. There is a system called, and I hope I'm not giving you too many details, but there's a system called TAGR, which is the tracking of Auditor General recommendations and reports that they use within the government to monitor what is happening with our recommendations. So all of those things I think contribute, and then I think there's just, in my perspective, having been at this for 30 years, I think there is a different relationship and a different view of audit than there was 30 years ago, where I believe the sense I get is that they look at us as adding value and being an important step. So I think that actually helps that outlook. So I think all of those things have contributed to the increased completion rates. Now, I think there are still things that could happen, better. In terms of perhaps increasing that, and that may be a little more reporting back to PAC on an interim basis from the internal audit group perhaps, or from the audit committee, some sort of ongoing mechanism where you folks have a little bit more of a role. It would also, I think, give you an opportunity to be a bit more proactive to say, okay, we're already hearing that these ones are on track or off track. Maybe we want to earlier on get engaged with an organization to say, it's only been a year. The AG is not coming back for a couple of years, but it's not looking too promising here. Why? Let's have a discussion. And, in some cases you may say, yeah, that makes sense. In other cases you may say, this doesn't make sense to us, and here is some feedback we will give you. So I think I'm trying to give you a sense of the positive things that I think have contributed, which I think are tangible changes, and then some areas where I think could probably even enhance the rates that exist today.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I would absolutely agree with you, humbly agree with you in the sense that, you know, there's value in I guess a second set of eyes on something, and whether it's constructive criticism, positive feedback, what have you, no one person or even one office necessarily going to, you know, right the ship, so to speak. I mean, it's important that there are different sets of eyes on anything, and I'm pleased to hear that the deputies across the board are taking that on very seriously, as I would anticipate they would, and seeking and appreciating the feedback that they're receiving through these audit processes as a means to improve public services. I'd like to shift gears a little bit, Mr. Chair, and a couple of different occasions we reference, and I guess it's common practice based on my short experience on this committee, that these audits have kind of a 2-year window, I guess, and Mr. Pickup, through the chair, you've indicated that you're focused on trying to establish recommendations that are achievable within that time frame. I'm wondering, you know, and I think of some of the major things that have taken place with respect. Prime example is the amalgamation of the health authorities. But my question is more general than that. When you're trying to identify recommendations, and if I'm understanding you correctly, your goal is to try and create attainable recommendations. Are there things that, like, how do you weigh in things that perhaps would take a more substantial amount of time than the 2-year window that we're talking about here? Please and thank you. Mr. Pickup.
So the recommendations, and I probably didn't do as great a job explaining this part up front, but I'll add it on now, without trying to do sort of audit 101, is the recommendations that we make are very much flowing out of the conclusion that we make on an audit objective. So, for example, you know, did you follow the delegation of signing authorities to approve checks? Okay, that could be the audit question. We would do the work and say, okay, let's say if we said it wasn't followed, the audit recommendation would be you should follow your delegation of signing authority. So the recommendations very much flow out of that. Now, to your question about can they generally be acted upon within the 2 years? I think yes, and I think the demonstration of that has happened this year with 12 organizations achieving 100%. But I would go back to something that I said earlier that I would like to even say again, is that where organizations feel that it's going to take or think that it's going to take longer than 2 years, I encourage them to put that in the response. To say, you know, realistically, this is going to take us 3 years or 4 years. And just on the example I would give with the surgical wait times, one of the recommendations that I think you subtly referred to was the public reporting of interim targets, right? So that was about putting the targets out there as to what you think you're going to achieve, not about achieving your 2020 target or the national standard quicker. It was just about sharing with people when you think you're going to achieve and how you're going to achieve along the path to 2020. So there, I mean, it seems like a subtle difference, but it is quite a difference to say, you know, report the targets now that you should be able to achieve. We're not saying achieve the actual national standard within a certain amount of time. That is a management decision and a management call. So even on that one, I would argue that on the health authority ones, that those those recommendations would generally be attainable within the 2-year period as well.
Okay, thank you. And in my short time on this committee, it's appeared, I guess, common practice that, or, you know, and reasonably so, that most departments who undergo some type of an audit, who receive your recommendations or your office's recommendations, excuse me, that most are in acceptance of those recommendations as constructive criticism and an opportunity to try to better facilitate public services generally. So that's been my view on the different audits that I've seen your office present. Moving to through the chair, the Auditor General's office setting an initial goal of an 80% completion rate. I'm just wondering more, I guess, more thoroughly where that figure, where that percentage comes from. Like, is there any type of, like, how do we compare, I guess, to other jurisdictions? You know, I think it's important to your previous comments. It is important to set goals that are achievable, and so I guess in terms of how other jurisdictions might set that target figure, where do we stack up as a province amongst at least the federation?
Sure. So in answer to the first part of that question, that 80% that we set as a target is very much a judgment and very much specific, I would say, to the environment that we are in. So when I came here in 2014, you know, I think at that point the target was 90%, and we were looking at an actual rate of just over 50%. You know, and I've been at this for 30 years and spent 25 years at the Office of the Auditor General of Canada before taking on the AG role here. And, you know, one of the things I realized is that, you know, we could shoot for 90% or 100% or say the goal is 90% or 100%, but if we're actually at 50% and recognizing sort of the severity of some of the issues, that a more reasonable goal, I think, at the time and for now is 80%. Mm-hmm. Now, once the government surpasses the 80% or is getting closer, then I mean, these are things we continuously reevaluate as we look at our business plan. But keep in mind, I mean, that 80% is our objective. You know, it may be a question for the government to say, what is your own objective? Mm-hmm. You know, if the Auditor General says, you know, he would like to see 80% done within 2 years, what is your goal or objective? And that may be an interesting question. Now, to the heart of your question on terms of what's happening across the country. So when I worked at the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, over time what we did is we very much actually got out of this follow-up business in terms of giving complete follow-up reports on all of the audits. And the reason, while I don't speak for that office, the reason why we did that based on my experience was because of the maturity of internal audit within each of the departments, they were able to do this work and report to audit committees of departments that included independent, mostly private sector members on these audit committees. So the follow-up was actually being done within each of the entities and organizations by a very professional and sophisticated internal audit group. So it was different. So we were kind of able to get out of that business of doing the follow-up, which in many ways is very advanced but makes a lot of sense, because ultimately, you know, why does an organization want to implement recommendations of the AG? it's not to please the AG, it's to make a better organization for themselves. So it very much made sense that we got out of that business. So we're not, I'm not announcing today we're getting out of that business. Here it's a different scenario and it's a different environment. So we'll stay in this business right now. Now in terms of, so that was the federal experience, which was my experience over that quarter century. In terms of other provinces across the country, it really does vary in terms of who does follow-up, who doesn't do follow-up, whether there's audits done on the follow-up, or if there's just reporting of a self-assessment by government. So it may be that the government said, well, we believe we did this, this, and this, and that gets reported without any audit work done, which would be different than what happens here, where we do audit-type work on what gets reported. So I can't give you sort of, an easy, I get it. I mean, I think that would be very useful, and it would, but if that doesn't exist across the country, where we all have these follow-ups where we can easily compare across the jurisdictions and be able to say, well, Nova Scotia is at 75.
Order, I'm sorry, the time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and to the PC Caucus and Mr. Houston for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to go back to the community services computer system and the business continuity plan. So if that computer system were to fail, there's some significant risks around the vulnerability of the data that's in there, who gets paid, are the correct people being paid the correct amounts, all these types of things. But the risks are serious with not having the business continuity plan, and what are some of the risks that you as a group have identified?
Mr. Atherton.
I think you covered them quite nicely, some of the key risks. Certainly in a community services based system, ensuring that the payments get to the people who need it isn't probably the ultimate risk. The security of data is important. That's obviously, that wasn't part of what we were looking at with follow-up. That's what we would have looked at in our original audit and identified the need for the business continuity plan to be in place.
If the system were to fail and there's no backup plan in place, people receiving assistance recipients could be left without access to funding, right?
That would theoretically be the case. I don't think at this stage, I'm not saying there is no backup plan in place. Our audit in 2014 identified the need for a business continuity plan and identified some key things that needed to be there. Our follow-up work, the department indicated they weren't complete at this stage. I can't speak to whether they are partially complete or have nothing in place at all. That's not part of what we were looking at. So you'd need to call the department in and ask the deputy where they stand and what their backup plans are.
Okay, that's interesting. So with the health authority, there was like on the wait times, they indicated not complete, but, and then gave an explanation that made it into the report. In terms of community services around this serious issue, they indicated not complete, but they didn't try to justify it with a series of buts, like in other words, but we have this to mitigate the risk, or but we have that.
Mr. Pickup.
So I think in fairness to that organization, the way we approach this is we don't, as a standard practice, if it's not complete, we just put in the box of not complete and then turn it over to you folks for discussion. So we don't reach out, given that we're doing, we have 20 audits here with so many organizations. It was exceptional and unusual that we reached out to the health authority to include that narrative, and that was only because I thought it was important, very important, that we include that. For all of these others, we're providing this to you with hopes that you'll reach out to some of these organizations to get updated.
Okay. So for the most part, it was just the interaction for this follow-up was limited to, have you completed this recommendation or not?
So when we ask, have you completed or not, the ones that we do audit-related work on are those where an organization says we have completed. So where you say you have completed, show us what you've done, and that's when we select what procedures we want to do. When someone says not complete, say, okay, that goes in our bucket of not complete. There really is no risk in terms of coming to you with something that is complete that should be not complete. That is where we focus, is on those complete. In terms of community services, so one of the risks that was identified back in the initial audit was around the controls, was that people who really aren't eligible for assistance are receiving assistance or continue to receive assistance after after they're no longer eligible. That's the risk. I'm just trying to remember back, and you might have it to hand, Mr. Atherton. There, did the audit at the time find any in the sample size where inappropriate payments had been made?
Mr. Atherton?
I'm afraid I'm not up to speed on the details
either,
from that time.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I do want to move on to fisheries and aquaculture. So the we're going to spring into action here. So the recommendation for fisheries and aquaculture at the time was that the department implement detailed written guidelines for assessing aquaculture applications, and this recommendation remains not complete. And I guess I probably know the answer that but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you know how applications are being processed in the absence of written guidelines for processing applications?
Ms. Chiasson.
From the original audit work they had processes that they followed, and they had certain almost like a checklist in a way that they would follow, but the details within, say, that checklist were very minimal. So our recommendation around that was you need to provide more detail and guidance to your staff as to what exactly they should be looking at, how they should assess whatever that particular piece was, so that it ensures sort of some consistency across what everyone is doing. And so that's what that recommendation was addressing.
And it's not complete.
And it's not complete.
To me, that, like, if that was my son, I'd say, come on, man. Like, how can you not have the written things? So I guess that surprises me. I'm coming to learn that folks at the Auditor General staff don't get surprised or not surprised by things. They just accept what's there as a reality. But that is, I mean, I don't know how you run a department without something like that. And of course, they haven't indicated as to whether they'll get around to doing it at some point. That's just, for now, it's just not complete.
They've said it's not complete, but that also indicates they still accept that the recommendation is valid and they are working towards it. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Pickup has a comment.
The only quick thing I would add is the reason why we are not surprised is, I think, goes to our objective mind, because we go into these things open-minded. So if we were to presume an answer, that's when we would be surprised. So that's why it doesn't mean we don't care. Of course we do. It just means we're not surprised or not surprised.
I understand. I want to talk about internal services. So you have a recommendation that internal services should implement an after-the-fact vendor review. And this recommendation is still not done, still not complete. I mean, we're living in a world where technology moves pretty quick. Like Uber's figured this out, Yelp has figured this out, Apple Store has figured out how to do these types of things. I mean, doing an after-the-fact review shouldn't be that complicated. It should be something that the Department of Internal Services could figure it out. Did you have any sense of what's the holdup as to why the Department of Internal Services can't figure out how to do an after-the-fact vendor review?
Ms. Chiasson.
Again, not to sort of sound like a stuck record, but again, this was a recommendation that was not complete. So when we saw that the department had assessed it as not complete, it went into our not complete bucket, and that was the end of our work on that. We would have examined, had they said it was complete, we would have looked at, okay, what have they been doing to show that they have implemented it. But in this case, they said it was not complete, so that was the end of the work that we did on that one.
As long as the Department of Internal Services doesn't get around to coming up with a methodology for doing it after the fact review of the relationship with the vendor, as long as they don't get around to doing that, is it a risk that the province blindly continues to contract with bad vendors over and over because nobody's kind of looked at how it's gone in the past? Is that a legitimate risk?
That recommendation was made because that's what doing a review after would help mitigate a risk that you had a vendor that had poor performance. So if you're in a future contract, it would be beneficial to know that maybe this, if the vendor makes an offer again, that they might not be the best vendor to have or should be a factor considered. And if you don't have this process to have that knowledge to be passed on, who's ever then looking at a new contract situation may or may not be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess at the time the recommendation was made, that means that there weren't mitigating policies that kind of gave some comfort that the risk really wasn't exist. Well, maybe we don't have a formal review process, but we do this, this, and this. But that's not in place. Otherwise, if that was in place to a suitable degree, then the recommendation wouldn't have been made, correct? So the fact that the recommendation was made suggests that there's no mitigating factors or policies.
I can't speak to the actual details of what went on at the audit at that time, but it would be reasonable that had the department had an alternate process that would mitigate that risk, they would have brought it up at the time and we wouldn't have had a need for a recommendation. So the recommendation suggests there wasn't something else in place.
Okay, thank you. I do want to move to the, how am I doing for time, Mr. Chair?
You have 4 minutes remaining.
4 minutes, thank you. I do want to move to the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. There was a recommendation made that the department should clearly define and communicate responsibilities of board management, governing boards, clearly define the relationship and communication responsibilities between the boards and the department. I guess that's now complete, is it, by wiping out the school boards?
Mr. Pickup.
So if you look at the recommendations that are not complete in the area of education and the audits that we did on those in terms of oversight, there are 7 recommendations that we would still deem as relevant. And that there needs to be a look at the principles underlying those recommendations. Those recommendations are really about oversight, they're about looking at the assessment or the monitoring of student achievement, they are about looking at the types of information those charged with oversight need. So the principles of those recommendations remain, and nobody has put forward the idea that those recommendations are no longer relevant. So what we'll be looking for is for government to take its new structure and say, okay, let's look at the principles behind those recommendations and see how we are now going to implement them, because they're about oversight and accountability and, you know, on student achievement. The principles are still there. How that is structured may be different, but the recommendations remain relevant.
Okay. In terms of labor and advanced education, your office recommended that that labor and advanced education should develop and implement a new funding model without further delay. The recommendation was that a new funding model be developed without further delay. That was in November 2015. So would it be fair to say that there has been further delay?
Ms. Chiasson.
When we went to follow up on it, it was not complete, so it's, as of our reporting date, it was not complete.
Do you believe, or do you have any reason to believe that as we sit here today, there's a comprehensive, auditable funding model currently in place for funding of universities?
We'll be looking at it again next year, so we'll know next year when we do our follow-up. But at this point, I don't know.
I think with some of the situations that have come to light around different little side deals for funding and stuff, I think that when we look back, we'll say that recommendation probably would have protected a lot of people. You removed one recommendation from your reports indicating that you agree with government management that the recommendation is no longer applicable. What was that recommendation?
I can't remember offhand.
Mr. Pickup.
You'll have to remind us which one that was. We don't. I have the 52 not complete, but we.
No, I think it's just stated in there that one was recommended
okay.
in the report. One was recommended because they didn't agree. It's no longer applicable.
So while they look for the specific recommendation, generally, it's a high bar to get us to that point. So we would have a discussion around the principles underlying it and whether it's relevant or not. So they must have convinced us.
Order. Time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to go to the responsible gambling recommendations where there were 4 recommendations not complete. And I'm recognizing that they fall under the Department of Health and Wellness. But our party has just recently asked questions of the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board, who is responsible for the responsible gaming strategy. And we asked questions about why the responsible gaming strategy has not been updated since 2011. And the response was that the ongoing strategy provides a guide for any government. So I would just welcome your thoughts on whether strategies being complete or strategies being updated is relevant to actually making progress on recommendations that fall within different departments where, like in the case of responsible gaming, there are multiple different departments involved.
Ms. Chiasson.
The recommendations that are outstanding, 4 of the 5 related to the Department of Health, and that's looking at the related to the prevention and treatment of problem gaming. So it's on kind of that side of what we did with the audit. So it clearly was under the Department of Health at that time. So that's who we would look to for completing those. Okay. I'm going to just take this opportunity to sort of educate myself a bit because I am, as a relatively new MLA, constantly struck by the number of different strategies that have had significant public input, considerable government effort expended on them. I mean, certainly the responsible gaming strategy is one of those, but I also think about the natural resources strategy, the dementia strategy, the mental health strategy, the housing strategy, just to cite several where they have been either fully abandoned or partially walked away from. And I just want to understand from an auditor's perspective, to what extent what you are auditing would overlap or would map onto any of those strategies. Like, are those just ephemera that are words, and it doesn't matter if citizens of Nova Scotia have spent, thousands of volunteer hours sort of setting certain goals? Does that not become a real thing within government that you could go back to and look at?
Mr. Pickup.
So depending on the audit topic, you know, when we set our audit criteria, when we enter something that we're going to audit, you know, we look at sort of what the government has set out in terms of what they plan to do, respecting, of course, you know, we're the auditors. We're not there to set policy or put their plans into what government plans to do. We're there to audit how well government is doing what they said they were going to do, essentially, right? If I simplify. So if you take things like the mental health audit that we did, you know, part of what we looked at in that audit was the mental health strategy that had come in a number of years ago, and how that was implemented. So it very much is case specific, respecting that at the end of the day we're auditing sort of the performance of what government is doing based on what it said it's going to do and what it set out to achieve, and depending on the area of audit that we're in, that could be policies, that could be strategies, that could be laws and regulations, that could be any number of things. But you know, we're always in fairly safe territory, I think, when we do that, but it very much does relate to the circumstances around the audit at the time.
But so the message to Nova Scotians who are asked, for example, to consult on a given strategy, which may cut across departments, that, you know, there is potential for that work to stick across across changes in government and changes in policy direction.
So if we look back, and I'm going by memory here, so I'm going to test myself to some extent, but we did that mental health, the mental health management audit that we reported last year, and in that we looked at the mental health strategy that had been put in, I think around 2012 or 13 under the previous under a previous government. That mental health strategy had been, you know, developed through a number of means, including consultations, and then we looked at the strategy to say, okay, what has been done, who has had responsibility for what. I'm recalling in that report that we did, as an example, to say, for example, gender and diversity and the impacts upon mental health. That was one that got dropped in terms of with the amalgamation and with the between the health authority and the department, where each thought the other had taken responsibility. So there's a very clear example where we said, here's something in the mental health strategy. It hasn't been implemented and it got dropped. So I wouldn't say that, or I would say the opposite, I guess. I would say that in some cases, like on that audit, we very much went back to say the strategy, what happened to the strategy that was implemented.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for that answer. Again, just sort of taking this opportunity to educate myself a bit, many of the audits, some of them complete and some of them not complete, refer to business continuity. And I wonder if you know, that's not a term I use. So I wonder if you could just do a little bit of Audit 101 on business continuity.
Mr. Atherton.
Business continuity is basically how will the department or agency continue to do the key functions that it's determined are its key functions if some sort of a disaster happens, whether that's an IT system crashes or whether that's natural disaster. Could be the flu pandemic from a few years ago. So it's all about how will a department, how will a business continue its key core business in the event of an emergency. And I note that one of the relatively few recommendations related to business continuity, which is not complete, pertains to the Department of Community Services, where there's a recommendation that it should work with the Department of Internal Services to incorporate its business continuity plan into the province's disaster recovery plan. I recognize, you know, it's in the bucket of not complete, but I'm trying to understand, you know, would that have implications primarily for the department doing its work, or would it have implications primarily for its clients, who we know are some of Nova Scotians, you know, some of the most vulnerable Nova Scotians in terms of income level, and many, you know, the majority of them actually living with some form of disability. So
is it the department's operations that are vulnerable because that recommendation is not complete, or is it, you know, the department?
I think that if the department's operations are vulnerable, then it's the people who are receiving those services that are really at risk. And I think that would apply to any department, that it's the department identifies what its key processes, its key services are, but ultimately it's the people who receive those services who are exposed to the risk if something happens and there isn't an adequate business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan in place.
So certainly that would be a recommendation where we would, you know, want to follow up, because we know, for example, the national audit on climate change just came out, and we can expect there to be, you know, there's increased risk of disasters of the nature of Hurricane Juan or you know, flooding at the Chignecto, you know, linked to New Brunswick, et cetera, where the Department of Community Services does not have a relationship. Is that what I'm understanding with, you know, provincial emergency management in terms of how it would continue to support its clients?
Nothing certainly in our follow-up would suggest they don't have a relationship. All I can say is that the recommendation to incorporate their business plan into the province's disaster recovery plan is not yet complete. I think to get more information on that would require, you know, calling in either the deputies of internal services or community services and having a discussion to see what does exist, what level of relationship is there, what stage are they at in incorporating those plans together.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to some of the recommendations related to the NSHA when the original recommendations were made related to again surgery wait time and the reporting processes. The recommendations were made to the Annapolis Valley Health and Capital Health. In the most recent budget, we saw more money for hip and knee surgeries, but there still doesn't seem to be a plan. Does budgetary allocation address concerns, or is it not budget related?
Mr. Pickup?
So we haven't attempted, of course, to assess the response from the health authority and the information that we have put there. So, you know, to venture into how that will, what will happen as a result of that. I think what the important part of that again is to say, okay, given everything that is happening, what will that mean in terms of the interim targets over the next 2 years? And if you go back to that 2014 audit on the surgical wait times, the Department of Health included a discussion in there that said, in its 2015 business plan, they indicated that if they had $35 million investment and $7 million a year, they could get to a year waiting time within 4 to 5 years. So that was in 2014. And that was in the department's, in their statement of their mandate, their business plan at that time. So all I'm saying is what they said back in 2014. Today, the health authority has indicated all of the action they're taking and that they believe that this will get them there in 2020. We haven't re-audited it. We haven't looked at that. I can't give you any kind of information onto whether or not that will happen, but I can say I think it's more than fair game for you to ask the health authority to say, okay, well, show us something between now and 2020 as to how we can assess whether you're on track to meet those standards and to cut wait times by a year in the next 2 years.
Again, I'm struck by the challenge we face where the NSHA's board meetings and minutes are not transparent. So, you know, if we pose a question related to that to the Minister of Health, it will be that is an operational decision of the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Yeah, do you have do you have further advice for us?
Sure. My advice is given with all due respect and not necessarily my place, but I would say the Public Accounts Committee could write to the Health Authority and say, you know, you accept these AG recommendations, including having public targets of wait times. When are you going to meet this? And provide us information, and then maybe invite them in to have the discussion. That would be my advice.
Yeah. Okay. Do the departments that are do the departments that you have audited and where there are recommendations incomplete, do they ever reach back to you of their own initiative, not when you're auditing, but in between times to, I don't know, seek clarification or advice or beg forgiveness in advance of you showing up to do your follow-up audit?
So I will, and my colleagues to my left and right can certainly add or even suggest. I don't have the full story, but I think I would know. But generally, I'm pretty comfortable that this is an exercise in dealing with us for this follow-up report, that certainly I'm not getting a lot of calls after the audits to say, you know, here's where we now stand in advance of when the time will come to report. Certainly if my colleagues to my left or right want to add anything where they're getting those calls and I don't know, certainly clarify, but I'm not seeing anybody jumping in, so I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that, you know, that is not happening. And I say that as a statement of fact, not as a complaint. You know, we're busy, you know, we're putting out probably 10 audits a year, in addition to following up 20 every year as well. So, because we're doing this follow-up work every year, so we're not.
Time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Horn.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. I think the Office of the Auditor General is important to be here and for clarity for Nova Scotians of what's happening within our government. I would like to ask about municipal affairs. I know they've completed the 8 recommendations that you have requested, but I don't understand just where DMA and the municipal units actually, if you've engaged in conversations with all of those units, or you just go with the Department of Municipal Affairs.
Ms. Chiasson?
For follow-up, the recommendations would have been made to the department, so that's where we would have gone to get the information to verify that, yes, indeed, the recommendation was
So
complete.
you don't have really any interchange or any discussions with the community municipal governments?
Mr. Pickup?
No, partially because with the municipalities we have no mandate, right? So they're outside the government reporting entity, and I think the only interaction I've had with municipalities is I think I was invited in to speak to the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities on openness and transparency and public reporting of expenditures. But so we would have no general business to call up a municipality and start asking questions.
It's kind of what I've understood, but I just was wondering if in your going to the municipal units, as far as the Union of Municipalities, if you did discuss those type of issues that they might have with taxes and collecting of taxes and so on.
Right. So I went, you know, of course, just to be invited in to talk about that, just as a general interest of theirs. But no, you know, even and it's been public, even when municipalities have reached out to say, you know, could you come and audit us if we asked you? And I say, you know, really, we can't. That's not how the legislation works, and those issues are up to the government, and you'd have to reach out to the government. So we tried to be very careful. Even when we did, I would add, the university funding audit, we are really looking at how government is fulfilling its role in overseeing the funding to both of those groups.
So DMA has come up with a process to look at negatively collected funds or finances for the municipalities?
So we were satisfied that the recommendations were complete. So as part of our work on this, if they say it's complete, we would have gone and looked at what they were doing and satisfied ourselves that it was complete.
Any comments on the Department of Municipal Affairs on their abilities to reach these determinations that you're satisfied with?
I think, any organization that can complete, 100% of recommendations within the 2 years, I think is a positive thing. So I think that's a positive comment.
Okay, that's all I have today.
Thank you, Mr. Horn. We'll move to Mr. McGuire.
Thank you for coming here today. I just want to, first of all, thank you for diving into the drinking water. I don't know if I recall over the last, my time here, if anyone's ever audited that. So I think it's a very important topic for people here in HRM and all of Nova Scotia, actually. There are communities throughout this province that obviously have challenges when it comes to drinking water. You saw a 25% increase in completion between 2014 and 2018. And you talked about us getting to, you would like to see us reach 80%. So we're at 75% right now. Any recommendations on how we get that extra 5%? And overall, were you happy seeing that all the hard work of yourself and all the staff in your department, for the most part, I think was taken quite serious, and my time here probably more serious than I've ever seen it. So what's your overall feelings about all of that?
Mr. Pickup.
So firstly, I would say the credit all goes to those in government, not to us. I mean, we make the recommendations, and although we have it as a target, it's not for us to implement. So I think all the credit goes to the folks in cross government and to the public service all across Nova Scotia who are implementing these recommendations. So I think really it is their success, and I did want to say that. Now, having said that, I would give some credit to my colleagues next to me and to the people back in the office who I think work with the organizations we audit in an independent yet reasonable way that gets us to a point where we're comfortable, we've done our audit work, we're comfortable, we've made conclusions, and sometimes we make tough conclusions, but that we make recommendations that make sense. So I think, there are some credit to the folks next to me here and to those back in the office as well. To go to your question in terms of how to go from 75 to 80%. I do think there are things that can be done. Now, I'll give you some suggestions without attribution to say if you do A, that's going to give you 1.5%. If you do B, that's going to give you 2%. I can't give you that level of precision, but I can say that I think, and I always want to be careful saying this because I think oversight is important, and I think the PAC is important, and I think it's an extra set of oversight, but I don't think people do the right thing just because somebody is watching them. Now, having said that, I think having a public accounts committee that's sort of engaged in some of these people and some of these audits that aren't going as well, I think would give an extra element of encouragement to see things move beyond the 75%, because one thing I realize is that, and I think this is a good thing, is that the people who are subject to these audits take coming to public accounts committee very seriously. Right, and to be held to accountable, and that's a major part of our system. So I think that is an added element. I think one of the things that I'm watching, and I say this again with all due respect, is I think the Public Accounts Committee has done a good job, in my view, of calling in organizations that we audit, not only on follow-up, but after the audit to talk about the audit. I think that sends a message to people in the public sector that it matters to you how they are doing on their audits. So we're very much watching, although it's all your decision, of course, we're very much watching to see the audits that we do, the new ones. Our Public Accounts Committee calling them in? Because if suddenly you're not bringing our audits in to talk about, I think that message will become clear in the public sector that, well, you know, we're probably not going to go to Public Accounts Committee anyway because they're not calling in the Auditor General's reports. So we're very much watching sort of as you set your agenda, with all due respect, of course, and we don't get a input and we shouldn't, but we're very much watching to see, okay, how many of our audits are getting called. So to go back to your question, I know I use it as an opportunity to sort of push something that's important to me, but I'm only saying that because I think it does make a difference. Respecting, I think, that the system that is working well now, you know, needs to, the strength of that needs to keep happening. So people like the senior deputy minister, I think, needs to keep keep this important to her in her relationships with her deputy ministers, that this remains important. I think some of that element can be extended outside of the core public service, so that you get these other organizations that there's some accountability. And I think also what I said before in terms of, I think there's a role for some interim reporting through the audit committee and through internal audit back to this committee, so at least you get a sense on a more regular basis as to how things are going, so it's not a surprise when we end up here today. So,
and I would agree. I think that holding departments and individuals to account, adds some teeth to the report. Obviously, if your recommendations are put forward and we as a committee do not follow up, I think there's less incentive for people to follow through on these incentives. But I would also say that when your report is put forward and is successfully, the recommendations are successfully completed, it also shines a very positive light on our public service, and it is a positive situation for the public to know that an independent, nonpartisan group is giving recommendations that are being accepted by the public service and government in general. So I think it adds confidence to this whole process, and it adds confidence to the public sector when we see your recommendations at a 75% clip, which is, like we discussed earlier, we started here in 2014. I've had the privilege to sit on this committee the entire time. I've seen frustration from those that are across from me, including your department, when these recommendations that you work so hard on, some of them are not kept. So to see, I think it's a positive step forward. You're right. I think there's still more work to be done. Obviously, we'd love to see 100% of these recommendations put in place. My question would be, I'm assuming, maybe I'm being, conspiracy theory or something, where there's a group of Auditor Generals and you guys all discuss amongst yourself some of the issues that you face as individual provinces, and that are we seeing 100% clip from any province? Where, if we end up 75–80% on your recommendations, where does that fall among the provinces of Canada? And are we seeing? I mean, I would say that every member, whether they're in government or not, on this committee should be proud to see a 25% increase in recommendations. And so, are we seeing that kind of increase anywhere else? Completion in Canada?
So on the actual statistics for the country, we don't actually have them, and there's quite a variety across the country of how people measure this. But I know, just sort of anecdotally, like when I go and I do meet with my colleagues 2 to 3 times a year, and one of the things that I will say to them, as I would say to you publicly today, is this is good. I'm pleased with the progress to get here now. Let's hope it keeps like this and gets even better. And certainly I can't recall anybody saying that their provinces have 100%. And it does vary. I know there's self-reporting that some governments do, and so it's quite a mixture across the country. And we've never really sort of come together to try and say, okay, let's try and have one standard approach, because part of it is every AG works with their Public Accounts Committee, works with their legislatures to see what works in that area. So it's kind of hard to say, okay, here's what works in Nova Scotia, and this is the way they like it. Oh, you should do this in Ontario, and you should do this in Alberta. It's kind of a a sensitive issue, if you will. So, but certainly, you know, my message to the AGs behind closed doors would be the same as it is right now, is that, you know, this is good, and I'm, you know, while I take no credit, I certainly am happy, one as the AG and one as a Nova Scotian, to see things going in the right direction.
I would say that you and the individuals that work with you should take a moment to take some credit on this. I appreciate you not, you know, you wanting to kind of stay out of the limelight with this stuff, but you know, it is a credit to the work that you all do as individuals, that our public sector does, and of course leadership within government, to show that we see such an advancement in the recommendations. I do want to quickly ask, we talked about there was some talk about community services and security within community services. How many breaches, external breaches in information have happened, external, not internal, within community services? Because there is a big difference between internal and external. The internal breaches is much easier to happen. It could just be as simple as somebody leaving their computer unlocked. It could be as easy as a disgruntled employee, things like that. But an external breach is much more difficult, because you actually have to get through security systems, network administrators, and depending on the operating system, you know, there's a big difference between a Windows OS and a Linux and Ubuntu and things like that. So you really have to have a level of security detail to actually do an external audit. So how many breaches have happened externally within government and DCS?
Mr. Atherton, you have 20 seconds.
I don't think it'll take that long. For this work, we're just looking at the implementation of our recommendations. So I am not familiar with what the individual statistics would have been in 2014 when we did the original audit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The time for questions has expired. Mr. Pickup, would you like to provide closing comments?
Sure, it'll be relatively quick. I did just want to, and this will sound like an accountant and an auditor, which I am, of course. But just to clarify, so the percentage increase went from 53 to 75, and in whole numbers that's 20-some%. But in actual change, it's 43% increase from 2014. Right, because it's 20-some% on the 50-some, so it's actually a 40-some% increase over the last 4 years. So that's the accountant, auditor, and me just wanting to clarify that. So anyway, thank you to the committee. You know, I very much get the easy job, I think, of coming here today and speaking to this. The people who do all the hard work are the folks next to me, but probably even the harder work are the folks across the street who continue to work on the report for the sorry, that wasn't on purpose, that cough. I do have a cold. But anyway, my hat goes off with all sincerity to the public servants and leaders across the province. I think, you know, my job, I think, is once compared to an umpire, you call what you see. So I've called the good, and I called the ones that need to do better. And I think we've been very clear about that today. So I think that's positive. For those organizations who aren't having the success that the rest of government has had, I believe they should be held accountable for not doing so. And I again respectfully encourage this committee to perhaps look at calling in some of those folks or reaching out to them. One thing the committee may want to consider is you know, sending some sort of template request, perhaps with a 2-page limit, to say, you know, here's everything that you have is not complete in the AG's report. When will this be done, and what are the risks to achieving this, and what times, in a very confined way. We haven't discussed this before, and the person on my left and right may have something to say after we leave, but if the committee decides to pursue something like that, we would be more than happy to help you draft some sort of template or approach if that was something the committee wanted to do. So anyway, that's it for closing comments. We'll be back at the end of May with the report on correctional facilities and on maintenance enforcement and grants and contributions distributions late May. And the other thing I would add, this is our first time under this approach to tabling the report the day before we come to public accounts. So I hope that was a help. And if there's feedback on that or how we're doing things, just provide it to us, please.
Thank you for that, Mr. Pickup. Thank you to your colleagues and to your office for all of the work you've been doing and for sharing this report with us. Your last comment is something I think we will discuss in our next subcommittee meeting of this committee. But I think everybody appreciated receiving the report yesterday in advance, and for those who needed to prepare last night for this morning's meeting. So thank you for your work, and thank you to all the members of the committee for your work today. Our next meeting is on April the 18th, so there is no meeting next week. Next meeting is April the 18th with the Department of Business to discuss economic development and employment trends in the Nova Scotia film industry. We had one piece of correspondence from Department of Transportation. It was a correction information provided in response to information requested from our meeting of February 28th with them. Are there any questions on that correspondence? Hearing none, is there any further business to come before the committee? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.